this dichotomy is not understood very well because people are constantly lying about the nature of the businesses they're in. And this is why this is, in my mind, this is the most important, it's not necessarily the most important thing in business, but I think it's the most important business idea that people don't understand, that there are just these two kinds of businesses. And so let me say a little bit about the lies that people tell. And so you basically, if you sort of imagine that there was a spectrum of companies from perfect competition to monopoly, the apparent differences are quite small because the people who have monopolies pretend not to. They will basically say, and it's because you don't want to get regulated by the government, you don't want the government to come after you, so you will never say that you have monopoly. So anyone who has a monopoly will pretend that they're in incredible competition. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you are incredibly competitive, and if you're in some sort of business where you will never make any money, you will be tempted to tell a lie that goes in the other direction, where you will say that you're doing something unique that is somehow less competitive than it looks, because you will want to differentiate, you want to try to attract capital or something like that. So if the monopolists pretend not to have monopolies, the non-monopolists pretend to have monopolies, the apparent difference is very small, whereas the real difference, I would submit, is actually quite big. And so there's this distortion that happens because of the lies people tell about their businesses, and the lies are sort of in these opposite directions. Let me drill a little bit down further on the way these lies work. And so, the basic lie you tell as a non-monopoly is that we're in a very small market. The basic lie you tell as a monopoly is that the market you're in is much bigger than it looks. And so typically, if you want to think of this in sort of set theoretic terms, you could say that a monopoly tells a lie where you describe your business as the union of these vastly different markets, and the non-monopolist describes it as the intersection. So that, in effect, if you're a non-monopolist, you will rhetorically describe your market as super small. You're the only person in that market. If you have monopoly, you will describe it as super big, and there's lots of competition in it. So some examples of how this works in practice. So I always use restaurants as the example of a terrible business. And this is always, sort of my idea is that, capitalism and competition are antonyms. Capital is someone who accumulates capital. A world of perfect competition is a world where all the capital gets competed away. So you're opening a restaurant business. No one wants to invest because you just lose money. So you have to tell some idiosyncratic narrative, and you will say something like, well, we're the only British food restaurant in Palo Alto. So it's British, Palo Alto, and of course that's too small a market because people may be able to drive all the way to Mountain View or even Menlo Park. And there probably are no people who eat nothing but British food, at least no people who are still alive. And so that is, that's a sort of a fictitiously narrow market. There's sort of a Hollywood version of this where the way movies always get pitched is, okay, it's like a college football star, joins an elite group of hackers to catch the shark that killed his friend. Sorry. And so now that is a movie that has not yet been made. But the question is that the right category, or is the correct category, it's just another movie? In which case, there are lots of those. It's super competitive, incredibly hard to make money. No one ever makes money in Hollywood doing movies. It's really, really hard. And so you always have this question about, does the intersection, is it real? Does it make sense? Does it have value that one should ask? And of course, there are startup versions of this where the sort of the really bad versions, you just take a whole series of buzzwords, sharing mobile, social apps, you combine them, and you have some kind of narrative, and whether or not that's a real business or not it's generally a bad sign. So it's almost this pattern recognition. When you have this rhetoric of this sort of intersections, it generally does not work. The something of somewhere is really mostly just the nothing of nowhere. It's like the Stanford of North Dakota. One of a kind, but it's not Stanford. So let's look at the opposite. The opposite lie is if you are, let's say, the search company that's down the street from here and has about a happy 66% market share, and is completely dominant in the search market. Google has not almost never describes itself as a search engine these days, and instead it describes itself in all these different ways. So it sometimes says it's an advertising company. So if it was search, you'd say, wow, it's like it has this huge market share that's really, really crazy. It's like an incredible monopoly. It's much bigger than a much more robust monopoly than Microsoft ever had in the 90s. Maybe that's why it's making so much money. But if you say it's an advertising market, you could say, well, there's search advertising is 17 billion, and that's part of online advertising, which is much bigger, and then all U.S. advertising is bigger. And then by the time you get to global advertising, that's close to 500 billion. And so you're talking about 3.5%. So a tiny part of this much larger market. Or if you don't want to be an advertising company, you can always say that you're a technology company. And so, sorry, let me just see. And the technology market is something like a $1 trillion market, and the narrative that you tell as Google in the technology market is, well, we're competing with all the car companies with our self-driving cars. We're competing with Apple on TVs and iPhones. We're competing with Facebook. We're competing with Microsoft on Office products. We're competing with Amazon on cloud services. And so we are in this giant technology market where there's competition in every direction you look. And no, we're not the monopoly the government's looking for, and we should not get regulated in any way whatsoever. And so I think one has to always be super aware that there are these very powerful incentives to distort the nature of these markets one way or the other. So the evidence of narrow markets in the tech industry is if you basically just if you look at sort of some of the big tech companies, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, they've just been building up cash for year after year, and you have these incredibly high profit margins. And I would say that one of the reasons the tech industry in the U.S. has been so successful financially is because it's prone to creating all these monopoly-like businesses, and and it's reflected by the fact that these companies just accumulate so much cash they don't even know what to do with it beyond a certain point. And so let me say a few things about how to build a monopoly. And I think one of the sort of very counterintuitive ideas that comes out of this monopoly thread is that you want to go after small markets. If you're a startup, you want to get to monopoly. You're starting a new company, you want to get to monopoly. Monopoly is you have a large share of a market. How do you get to a large share of a market? You start with a really small market and you take over that whole market, and then over time you find ways to expand that market in concentric circles. And the thing that's always a big mistake is going after a giant market on day one, because that's typically evidence that that you somehow haven't defined the categories correctly. And it normally means that there's going to be too much competition in one way or another. And so I think almost all the successful companies in Silicon Valley had some model of starting with small markets and expanding. And if you take Amazon, you start with just a bookstore. We have all the books in the world, so it's a better bookstore than anybody else has in the world when it starts in the 90s. It's online. There's things you can do you can't do before, and then you gradually expand into all sorts of different forms of e-commerce and other things beyond that. eBay. You start with Pez dispensers. You move on to Beanie Babies, and eventually it's all these different auctions for all these sorts of different goods. And what's very counterintuitive about many of these companies is they often start with markets that are so small that people don't think that they're valuable at all when you get started. The PayPal version of this was we started with power sellers on eBay, which was about 20,000 people. When we first saw this happening in December of '99, January 2000, right after we launched, there was a sense that these were all, it was such a small market, it was terrible. We thought these were terrible customers to have. It's just people selling junk on the internet. Why in the world do we want to be going after this market? But there was a way to get a product that was much better for everybody in that market. You could, and we got to something like 25, 30% market penetration in 2 or 3 months. And you got some lock-in, you got brand recognition, and you're able to build the business from there. So I always think these very small markets are quite underrated. The Facebook version of this I always give is that the initial market at Facebook was 10,000 people at Harvard. It went from 0 to 60% market share in 10 days. That was a very auspicious start. The way this gets analyzed in business schools is always, that's ridiculous. It's such a small market, it can't have any value at all. And so I think the business school analysis of Facebook early on, or of PayPal early on, or of eBay early on, is that the markets were perhaps so small as to have almost no value. And they would have had little value had they stayed small, but it turned out there were ways to then grow them concentrically, and that's what made them so valuable. Now I think the opposite version of this is always where you have super big markets, and there's so many different things that went wrong with all the clean tech companies in the last decade, but one theme that ran through almost all of them was they all started with massive markets. And every clean tech PowerPoint presentation that one saw in the years 2005 to 2008, which was sort of the clean tech bubble in Silicon Valley, started with, we're in the energy market, we're in a market that's measured in hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars. And then once you're sort of a minnow in a vast ocean, that's not a good place to be. That means that you have tons of competitors and you don't even know who all the competitors are. And so you want to be a one-of-a-kind company where it's the only one in a small ecosystem. You don't want to be the 4th online pet food company. You don't want to be the 10th thin film solar panel company. You don't want to be the 100th restaurant in Palo Alto. Restaurant industry is a $1 trillion industry. So if you do a market size analysis, you conclude restaurants are a fantastic business to go into. And it's often large markets, large existing markets typically mean that you have tons of competition, very, very hard to differentiate. So the first very counterintuitive